of detail as the Virginia tombs. But the rest of Turkey was not impressive. It was the least impressive country that we visited in, maybe that's the places we went to, but it was very conservative. The women were doing all the work and the men appeared to be out in the cafes, just smoking and drinking. And here we are in Cappadocia, this amazing chalkstone city with these amazing phallic weathered rocks. And on the left there is our guide, who is got a PhD in history and tried to convince us that it was important to have 2 women judges in every court because they couldn't make the decisions that a single male judge could make. We were astounded at his conservatism. And as we went further into Turkey, this became more and more evident. So at Cappadocia, we moved on rapidly to the Georgian border. And it was still quite early in May. I think it was, yeah, in May. And this incredible difference when we reached the coast, the Black Sea, it was quite a bit warmer. And we stayed the night in Batumi and witnessed all this amazing Russian architecture. Quite savage. Georgia, of course, is a Christian country, and the difference was staggering. And even more so in Tbilisi, when we got to the capital, where there were jazz bands, lovely wine, a very sophisticated sort of Southern European city. Forgive my cough. And as we moved on towards the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, I had an extraordinary experience. We stopped for lunch in the mountains in this Georgian restaurant where you each get a room with a wood-burning stove. And over the river, there was a cage with this chap, and he looked very tame. And I rather stupidly put my lens too close to the bars. And quick as a flash, he reached out and in effect punched my camera, which was quite a large sort of Nikon heavy thing, straight into my face. And I returned to join my friends, absolutely covered in blood, but I was quite lucky not to get more seriously hurt. The camera has still got his claw marks on it, which I proudly show to everybody. But putting bears in cages is something that I believe is quite acceptable in Russia. And this is ex-Russian. But on we went and into Azerbaijan. And this is the city of Baku, where we had the Eurovision Song Contest. Quite an impressive city, an incredibly corrupt government. And here we had our first serious problem, is that they wouldn't accept the visas in our passports. And we wasted 2 days and got stuck in the port area in no man's land. We couldn't go backwards or forwards. And here we are camping, wondering what on earth we were going to do, because once we got to Turkmenistan across the Caspian Sea, if our visas ran out, we would be deported. So we pressurized the port authorities, and eventually we got onto an illegal freighter taking petroleum spirit across. So they just parked the bikes on the back and they didn't even bother to shut the doors. There's all the petroleum. We were allowed free rein throughout the boat. Everybody was smoking. And when we got to Turkmenistan 2 days later, this is the shoreline of a country which has got one of the driest land masses in the world. Turkmenbashi is the port. We couldn't get in because there was an enormous queue of roll-on, roll-off ferries. And I think the local teams were on strike. Anyway, once we did get ashore after a day waiting, it's the only time we used our sat phone, is to ring our agent in London to try and see whether she could expedite our journey through Turkmenistan or give us some extra days. But we had a terrible time at the customs there, and they kept us there for hours, all the way through the night, going through all our belongings. And of course, we failed to realize that they were really asking for money and antibiotics. Eventually, I gave them some paracetamol, and they seemed very pleased, and on we went. And Turkmenistan was the most godforsaken desert. And in this picture, you can get an idea of you've got Ashgabat, which is on the Iranian-Turkmenistan border. From Turkmenbashi to Ashgabat is a very dry desert. But from there eastwards, the Soviets built a series of canals from the river Oxus, or the Amidara, which goes through Turkmenbat. And they basically irrigated the whole of that area where day 40 is. And it suddenly becomes quite green. Now, this is what I'd like to try and get across. This is a map of where Alexander got to. And if you can see the Caspian Sea and the Aral Sea, you see that the mountains are really drive right through from east to west through a band of desert. Saudi Arabia on the south, and you've got Kazakhstan and Mongolia on the north. And the mountains are what kicks up the weather, which provides the water. So that although getting through this area was very hazardous, it was really the only way you could travel and survive, by going through the mountains. This was achieved the other way around by Genghis Khan in the 13th, 14th century. Now, getting through to China on the road means that you, just like the people in the Silk Route, you have these amazingly hostile areas. In this map, you see the Taklamakan Desert, which is Western China, Xinjiang province. You've got the Gobi Desert. You've got Mongolia, which is pretty desert, but desert. Where it says Himalaya is basically the Tibetan plateau, the average altitude of which is 6,000 meters. That's just the average. And then you can see that in eastern China, you have a much more tropical climate. Surrounding the whole of Taklamakan is a great horseshoe of mountains. And I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail because it really is important for our trip, how to find a way through. Here is Genghis Khan moving westwards. And he travels on the north side of this great horseshoe, on the north side of the Taklamakan Desert and the Gobi Desert, and filtering down into Kabul and then on into the Caucasus. But he's once again following the water. I do beg your pardon about this. Just taking you back to Ashgabat is run by a cult figure called Gulabang Beri Muhammadov, and he's a complete nutcase. He challenges his whole population to a horse race if they would care to take part, and he has to win. He's described as one of running a sort of cult hero. process in his country, and the city of Ashgabat is empty. It's a faux city. We were allowed in and stayed at a nice hotel, but we did notice that by 6 o'clock, the city was completely empty. This is a row of houses called American Avenue. It's completely empty. Nobody lives in any of those houses. So onto the border with Uzbekistan, and the water on the River Oxus, or the Amidara, is flowing at about 6 knots and carries most of the bridges away. And so this floating bridge is one of the best ways to deal with it. And as you know, that the Tristara and the Amidara flow towards and used to arrive at the Aral Sea. Most of the water is taken off into irrigation systems for monocultures in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and also in Kazakhstan. And so the Aral Sea has now become a sort of toxic dump. Here's the dams and sluices controlling this massive irrigation scheme. At the border, we met this wonderful person, the border at Turkmenabat, on the border of Uzbekistan, and she is obviously completely in charge of money exchange on the border. She was a very striking figure, and we didn't quite realize that we needed a suitcase to do our deal. Just going out to a restaurant, you need a considerable amount of money, and I'll show you this in a minute. Now, this is a map which shows really the topography, I think, quite well. You can see running through, you've got the Hindu Kush on the south, you've got the Pamir Mountains to the right, and the famous Vagana Valley, which is very fertile. Now, I've just written in the route that we took. When we got to Bukhara, we went south into the Pamirs and then returned to Bukhara once again to meet up with partners, and then on to Samarkand. But you can see these phalanxes of mountains moving towards the west from the central Pamir Massif, and they are very difficult to cross. I just thought I'd include a picture of what the Aral Sea was like a few years back and what it's like now. And you've got cargo ships which are stranded in the middle of that desert. The one thing that we didn't manage to get to, because we were running so late with our visas, was the now famous museum at Nikos, which is on the River Oxus, about halfway to the Aral Sea. If you take the word Amu there, Nikos is there. And this very enterprising Russian electrician called Stavitsky went on a dig for his holidays in Uzbekistan, and he found all these modern paintings and artifacts that had been hidden away from Stalin, who was trying to remove them. And he had a secret museum there, which he opened in 1966. And then he started telling a load of Russian modern painters that he would safely look after his painting. And now it's a fabulous museum in the middle of the desert. And sadly, we didn't get to it. So if you look at this, this picture on the right, you've got the Taklamakan Desert, and you can see the Hindu Kush, the Karakoram Himalaya, the Pamir Himalaya, and it's like a stag's head with the stag with its mouth right open, the lower jaw in the Hindu Kush. And just below the antlers at the top, you've got the Fergana Valley. There is only one way through, one way through by land from east to west, and that is going through the Fergana Valley at the top then dipping down into the river that you can see, and then on to Kashgar in Western China. Or you go right up above the Tian Shan Mountains and dip down through the Turagat Pass, which is the route that um, we took. And this was proved to be quite an arduous trek. So that for those of you who have read anything about this area, I found the most interesting books, and we've had one of in our book club, Eastern Approaches by Fitzroy MacLean, The Murder in Samarkand by Craig Murray. Shows you how terrible the president was, boiling people in oil. And this has only just really sort of come to light in the last 20 years. Haji Murat by Telsoy is a very, very good account of Chechnya, and A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush. I just mentioned those because I wish I'd read those before I'd gone, but I found them very refreshing since we came back from this trip. Now, on the Uzbek border, they have a fantastic railway system to take all the cotton from the irrigation systems up into Russia. And these are the old Soviet railways. The countryside's now getting much greener with all the rain from the Pamirs. And we arrived with all these beautiful poppies, fields full of poppies, with cows enjoying themselves. It was just on the way into Bukhara. And Bukhara is a well-known station on the Silk Route, and its city walls and the city as a whole has been completely rebuilt, I think, by the Soviets initially, and now the Uzbek government, because it draws in the tourists. It's fabulous. I think it's a mud wall. Inside is beautiful bazaars and indeed very friendly hotels. Where we stayed for a few days, there's a mixture of sort of Turkic people and also Russian expats. The lady on the far right with 2 days on the far right were very friendly Russians from Moscow, and the others came from families who had lived in the area for a long time. But they loved the fact that we'd arrived on bikes, and they allowed us to keep our bikes and to sort of service them actually in the foyer of the hotel. There were very few other people there. So this just gives you a quick idea, as we had to do some servicing at this stage, how sort of very muscly the bikes are. You can see the very big fuel tanks and how easily everything is serviced by simply resting the bike on one of its panniers. And there it is with the wheels taken off. And you can see how it's got a very big travel, the back wheel, so it can go over very large rocks. It can go over open manhole covers. But the bikes always seem to have pride of place wherever we went. So whilst we were waiting actually for partners to arrive, we took a few days to go camping in the Pamirs. We had all this equipment, so we decided we'd better use it. Richard, our ex-diplomat, was a very good cook, and we had a very good supply of tinned gourmet French meals, which he dished up, much to the amusement of the local women who were working in the fields around us. And you can see it's lovely and green, very cool. We were at about 3,000 feet here, and we had a very pleasant stay. The local women used to work in the fields in these white coats. We thought they were working at the local hospital, but we found them all hoeing away in a large vegetable field. And they'd never seen sleeping bags before. And they insisted, they're a very forward lot, they insisted on trying them out. And they were very impressed with Richard, the cook, and tried to drag him off as a joke to the village because they'd never seen a man cook before. And here they are, they came over in the evenings. The evenings were beautiful, and we had, although you can't see it here, This was the view when the sun cleared. And at the evening, we used to have these lovely sunsets of the Pamir Mountains going up 20,000 feet behind us. Just behind us, there was an old Russian hydroelectric steam with no longer in use, but a very small one, just running off a local river. And unlike Turkey, the women were very forward and friendly, although she doesn't look it. And in Bukhara, it was quite interesting to see that the best school in Bukhara was a Jewish school, Bukhara being thoroughly Islamic. And all the local Islamic mothers did their very best to get their kids into the Jewish school. And as you can see here, wonderful mixture, a very harmonious mixing of cultures and religions, which was lovely. Also, I just show you this because the Russian occupation, the Soviet Union rather, a lot of equipment was left behind, and all the army who was stationed in the area. These are two original army tank captain hats, which we had to pay an enormous amount of money for, obviously quite valuable. And we had to come back a couple of days, and every time we came back, he raised the price. And eventually we got them before it got out of control. But I said that inflation was quite something, but that's the amount of money you need to go out to dinner with 4 people in Bukhara. Hence the lady telling us on the border that we needed a suitcase for a 2-week stay. And here's we got taken out one evening for a sort of ranch evening by the hotel. This shows you the fish farms in the desert where the Russians had, through irrigation of the Oxus, were producing a lot of fish for the local communities and also for shipping north. Here's an expat Russian guide who was very nice, showing us around the city of Bukhara, but also very weary about what he said politically, because he was at risk if he was caught criticizing the Uzbek government and politics. It said he would be disappeared if he said the wrong thing. So, although Uzbekistan was very friendly to us, obviously to locals, have had an extremely difficult time. The new president is much more lenient and less brutal. And then on to Samarkand, which is a beautiful Silk Road city, which has been rebuilt in the Russian era. Partners leave us by going to Tashkent and then on home. And here's a picture of Samarkand in the early 1900s. And this is what it looks like now. So the amount of work that's gone into it is quite considerable. The Blue Mosque in Samarkand is, I think, one of the wonders of the world. Beautifully intricate. And the use of blue is quite beautiful. And the other thing about Samarkand and Bukhara in Uzbekistan is that in the 15th century, Ulugh Beg was a great mathematician and astronomer who went during his university years to a famous university in Azerbaijan to study astrology, and came back. And once he became the Sultan of Samarkand, he started universities in both Bukhara and Samarkand, and they became centers of learning in the 15th century. And he created this incredible astrological building where they could measure the altitude of stars. and you can see all the tunnels at the back where people could observe exactly where the shadows of various planets and stars came. Right at the top of your picture, you see a small hole where the light came through. Moving on, the borders were closed because of the SARS epidemic directly into Kyrgyzstan. And so Kazakhstan was interesting, with a steppe, loads of guys on horseback, massive herds of cattle. We briefly spent a night in Simkent and then into Kyrgyzstan, which I think is probably the most beautiful country that we went through. And although the day that we got into the capital, Bishkek, near which there's an enormous American airbase, it was quite grey. That evening we went to listen to some wonderful Kyrgyzstan Russian opera in this opera house. Lovely deep bass voices singing Russian songs. And then we went back to our hotel and for breakfast in the morning. This was our view. We were now on the north side of the Pamir Mountains, rather brutalistic Russian architecture with 20,000-foot mountains in the background. It was really quite stunning. Once again, major service here, changing of oil. And then we're now having to wait for our Chinese guide at the border. So we stay and just meet up with a few of the people in the mountains. Lovely, friendly people. As you can see, very much more alpine. We found the birthplace of Yuri Gagarin and the MiG jet fighter that he trained in. And we saw Lake Ishigul, the largest high altitude, second largest high altitude lake in the world. Titicaca being the highest. This is at about 6,000 feet and it's 2,000 foot deep. Very beautiful, been toxically polluted. And then a day trip up high to look for the gold mine run by the Canadians, but we had to turn back at this point because the weather was unbelievably bitter and the road was a bit of a worry to us because of the traffic on it. And here is the truck with the gold casquettes that had very serious accidents with these trucks rolling off, but you can see the gradient of the road. On the way back, we met the wonderful falconers of Kyrgyzstan, and we thought we'd never see this, but this chap just jumped out of his car with a golden eagle on his wrist because he'd seen some rabbit. And there's his father and his grandson. Now we're beginning to have to move towards the Chinese border to meet up with our guide. We had to be there at exactly the right time. So we're going south now towards the Turagat Pass at 4,000 meters. And we're zooming through this beautiful landscape with these turquoise lakes and purple hills. And we're climbing up and we stay at a yurt camp run by some Russian expats who are trying to make a tourist go of it, welcomed with some drinks. It was extremely cold. It would be at 3,500 meters. I got altitude sickness. Well, I got early symptoms with headache, nausea. And it was about -5 in the tents at night. The next day, we went to visit one of the famous caravanserai, these large forts where the Silk Road camel trains could stay, could take 4 trains of camels at any one time. All the animals were kept inside at night, and there were great big sort of holes in the roof. And this is where the snow had come in, where all the camels would be tethered. Then you have one of these forts about every 40 kilometers, which is what a camel can walk in a day. And they stretch right across the Pamir Mountains to Samarkand, following the water but also having to endure the altitude. We continue climbing the next day, and there are many silk routes, but as you can see at the top, you've got the Fergana Valley, and the main routes are either side of the Taklamakan Desert or the Tarim Basin. I won't spend any more time on this, although it would be interesting. So we're trying to get to the Toragat Pass here on day 63. And we're trying to thread our way through this ridge here, these two ridges at 4,200 meters. And there's Lake Ishigul from a satellite photograph. And it's taken us about 3 days to get from the lake up to the pass. The final stage is fantastic differences in weather and very difficult biking with a lot of this going on. I was so full of headache and altitude sickness that I just took photographs while these guys tried to sort out the bikes. The weather got worse, and the Kyrgyzstani border police took one of our visas off us, which caused an enormous amount of problems in China. And there is the Kyrgyzstani office. But then you have a no man's land for about 80 miles. The weather changes for reasons that we couldn't understand. As you see, it was very hard going on the guys. I was driving the van, feeling lousy. And that just shows the Taklamakan Desert. And to the north, you've got the Tian Shan Mountains. In Tajikistan, you've got the Pamirs, and then the Himalayas, the Karakoram below. And here's the border, 4,000 meters up. And there's our wonderful guide on the right, Paul Shee, who had to accompany us the whole way and ensure that we left the country with all our gear. But he makes a living out of that. And he also tried to persuade us to go on horseback from Beijing to Milan, the trip he was organizing in the next year. It takes a year and a half. Coming down the other side towards Kashgar, there's beautiful, wide open valleys with enormous rivers in spate. So the guys were feeling pretty rough, having done a lot of high altitude stuff. We had to stop for a rest. There were problems on the road, such as this, which one had to be very careful about. First encounter with the Chinese border force. They were very polite and let us through. And eventually we got to Kashgar, a capital for the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang autonomous province. Not so autonomous now. The famous cattle market at Kashgar, all the mountain people bringing their animals, camels, cows, goats. Bikes get a good clean. You notice that Han Chinese wouldn't normally be living in this area, working, having been brought in by the Chinese administration. But you can see that the Uyghurs themselves are very proud and handsome people, and the town was vibrant. This is in 2011. I doubt this is like this now, and many of these people would have been interned. The women were stunningly beautiful and would ride around dressed like this on motorbikes. There's a funeral. And then along the south side of the Taklamakan Desert, where the waters of Tibet are traveling a few meters under the ground, going north rather into the desert. Enough water for these trees. But we go along the north side of the Tibetan plateau till we get to Hotan and then turn north through the desert. So wonderful sights. And here we meet up with a friend of my son's who's bicycling from London to Japan. We met him a few times on the way, very tough ex-paratrooper. Had finished a couple of turns in Afghanistan. Thought he still needed some exercise. You can see the Tibetan plateau on this, and sketched in the Silk Road routes through the desert, where they'd be picking up the north-going water through all those rivers coming off the Tibetan plateau. And they even got sandbanks on the side to stop the erosion of these rivers. The very poor Uyghur towns on the north side of the Taklamakan Desert, and sudden rainstorms where the water just disappeared very, very quickly. Sites like this we'd never seen, sort of poverty and disillusionment. We'd never seen it anywhere else on our trip. But once again, very proud and welcoming people, the Uyghurs. And I'm aware that we've only got 10 minutes left, but I'll just very quickly take you through a few of the desert shots. Here we are just before we're going along a 500-mile desert stretch, just checking that everything's okay. You see it's pretty dry. And there's Paul, our guide, making sure that we're all right and ready to go. Here's the Chinese attempt to stop the weathering, where they draw the water out of the ground with massive pumps. The water is only 50, 100 meters down, but the wind, I think, is winning here. Here we are at the end of this particular section, 45 degrees centigrade, about 500 degrees, 500 feet below sea level. And finally, arriving through the mountains of the northern Taklamakan Desert and start of the Gobi Desert, there's a lorry run out. Very brutal country till we arrive in Danung, which is a desert oasis town. These are the famous Buddhist monasteries, monasteries and caves in Magao, which has really only been opened in the last 100 years. They've been hidden. So we're now moving gently south through the Gobi Desert and back down onto the Tibetan plateau, where the people are once again very proud and different. There's some Buddhist monks. And these people object strongly to the forced culturalization from the Han Chinese. And very rapidly, once moving eastwards in China, you see the urbanization and desertification. Apart from one area of mountains, which is absolutely beautiful, just moving down towards Xi'an. That was Zhujiangzhou. It's off the Tibetan plateau and is a sort of alpine resort where a lot of the Chinese from eastern China come for their holidays. And as you can see, very different from anything else, such as these new cities that have sprung up, holding 10 to 20 million people in these tower blocks. There's hundreds of these new cities. Police always very friendly, want to take photographs. And eventually to Xi'an. And then the final through in the monsoon to a very odd road in eastern China. Beijing. Right, and I think I ought to stop there.
Thank you, Simon. That was, I think there are several impressions you get, like unforgiving and uninhabitable and lovely, running like within seconds of each other. It's quite an amazing thing. So if you could now unshare your screen.
So how do I do that?
So over on the right hand side, probably a system like stop sharing.
Yep.
So if you can, that's great. That's perfect. And
I do
then,
apologize for my cough.
well, you can't help it. I understand, because it's an allergy thing, and it's very frustrating when you've got it. So I would imagine there'll be one or two questions from people. So I think the easiest thing would be is if you turn your video on and your microphone and ask a question. I wanted to ask a couple of things before people get a chance to get in, so I'm going to have first go. Chairman's something or other. So how did you guys manage for languages, or did you always have a guide?
So that wasn't really a problem in Central Asia. Richard Margolis did Russian university, and so he said he could speak a bit of Russian. But when it came down to it, I think the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs, they didn't really speak much Russian either, so that didn't help. But for China, apart from our guide, Richard spoke very good Mandarin. And in the few times that we we had any problems, that was really helpful.
Okay. I mean, I think it would be one of the scariest things. You end up with some board with some guys, you can't speak English, or they can't speak English, and you can't speak whatever, and they take your visas off. You thinking, what are we going to do now? And how did you guys manage for fuel?
So we had about a range of about, in extremis, we had 1,000-mile range, half of it inside the van. So we were very careful not to let the tanks go below a third empty, a third full.
Right.
The only problem was the quality of the fuel. So the engines coked up. They're just making dreadful noise by the end, and they all had to be stripped down and the heads taken off and the carbon chipped off, but they were fine.
That's when you finished?
Yeah, when we got back. Yeah, when we
Right.
got back, we took them in for service, and they just said, "What have you been doing?" But that was bad fuel. But the bikes are very rugged, and they didn't have any problems.
Great, thank you. So Simon is very interested and willing to answer questions. So please feel free to unmute and turn your video on to allow him the opportunity to have some questions. Jonathan. So unmute, Jonathan. Thank you.
Hi. It sounds like it's a fantastic adventure, and I'm full of admiration for you setting out in the first place. Had you kind of worked out a game plan for what would happen in the event of a disaster, and getting home in a hurry, or insurance for sudden evacuation from where you were, or anything like that? Or did you just say, I hope it won't happen?
Yeah. So the Morocco trip showed to me that if we had a serious accident, then basically we had to get the person who had the accident had to be airlifted out. Then we were stuck with the bike. So we had a very powerful winch to pull the bike into the van. So with one severe accident, we had a get out of jail card. We could take the damaged bike and then export it at the end without any problems. The insurance is through a wonderful German company, a married couple, German insurance brokers, who just specialize in crazy trips. And because they had done so many, they knew what the risks were. I think we paid, for the whole group, we paid 2,000 quid, 3,000 quid insurance, which is absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
But most people don't do this trip without an organizing team, Globebusters being the most prominent British team doing it. And if you get organized in the way that we got, I went and spent a lot of time with Globebusters, and they wouldn't give us the names of the hotels, but they gave us everything else and they told us what to do. I made friends with them, and so we cut the risks right down, so that we didn't have accidents, and we looked after the bikes very carefully. I mean, traveling carefully in a group, there's a way of not going too fast is the other thing. Being able to leave the road and go off into the bush at 40 miles an hour. What to do if you have to do that. These bikes can do that. So we did a lot of training beforehand on rough surfaces. But we didn't even have a puncture.
Amazing.
So Morocco was a disaster. We had 2 serious accidents. I broke my leg. Another guy broke his tibia, had to be airlifted out. We had floods. Everything went wrong. Our guide's mother died halfway through, and all sorts of things happened in Morocco. But it was the learning point for this trip.
Well, I think it was fantastic. Really fascinating to hear it all about it. Thank you very much.
No, you're welcome.
Okay. Anybody else?
Wait a minute, I can't see.
Yeah, one from me. I'm Cameron in Clifton. Do you know how much it cost per head for the whole thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I didn't tot it up, but I know that the Globebusters team, they charge for the hotels, and the whole journey, they charge, I think, about 18,000 quid. However, we all kept hold of our bikes and used them for other trips, like the Alaska trip. And we flogged the van back to Globebusters because it was such high spec. It was left-hand drive as well. So we got quite a lot of money back on things which were quite expensive. But the other thing is that when you're biking 200 miles a day, and I was mostly driving the van, but I did do a lot of biking. It's interesting how you don't waste money on whipping down to B&Q for that extra, powerful drill that you don't need. So we were surprised in the end how our bank balances didn't seem to take great big hits. And also we had to really talk to each other about how much we were prepared to spend on hotels. I mean, a lot of the time there wasn't an argument because it was the only hotel in town. But we only picked our hotels really 3 days ahead, all done on the internet. So I don't know. All I know is that I probably put about five or 6,000 quid sort of into it. But also I was very frugal for those 4 months. And so I didn't come out too badly in the end. It probably cost about 10,000 quid each.
Fantastic value.
Yeah, for 4 months. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? How did you all get back from China, and how did you get your bikes back?
Yes, well, the only way you can travel in your own transport in China is to have a Chinese guide. Now, Paul and his wonderful brother, he basically has to be with you all the time in his guide car. He has to be on a prescribed route. And at the far end, he packs all the bikes up and the van into a single container.
Oh gosh.
So Ford Transits are designed to fit into a container. So we had about 3/4 of a long container, and he just basically one day took everything off us. We were just left with a rucksack each. Richard had lived in China for many, many years, and he had a beautiful house near the Great Wall of China, about 50 miles outside Beijing. And we stayed there, and the bikes and the van one day disappeared. And 3 months later, not getting stuck in the Suez Canal, they ended up in Southampton, and I went down and got them. So that's really the only way to do it. You have to be on a group visa. You have to get into the country, and then Paul had a lot of difficulty splitting that visa up so we could leave at different times. Because John had to go back for his son's wedding from Xi'an, and Susan took over driving the van, and I rode his bike. But by then we had split visas, and so it became much easier. But I mean, Paul organised that. He was a fabulous bloke, and as I say, he's running these amazing tours. You know, by going all the way from Beijing to Milan. I don't know whether they ever made it on horseback and camel, but that would be something else, wouldn't it? To do the Silk Route on camel.
So, Charles, did you have your? Did you?
Yeah, could I just ask about
and the Parker tricks are then next. So,
about the mountain sickness? Were you the only one who had the trouble, Simon, or and how long did it affect you?
Oh right, I was the only one to get it. I've had it before. It wasn't serious. I just had a terrible headache and actually felt quite depressed. But I was worried about it, and but as soon as we got through the Tourigat Pass, we descended very rapidly into the into the desert plain, Kashgar, and it just went away. I was invited walking in the Himalayas about 4 or 5 years ago, and I took acetazolamide, Diamox, and it was fantastic. I slept at 5,000 meters, climbed to 5,400 meters, and didn't have any symptoms at all. So I completely swear by Diamox. And if I'd known, I did know about Diamox, but I didn't think 4,000 meters would really do me in. But at the yurt camp near the Caravanserai in Kyrgyzstan, I really did feel rough, but the others didn't. So it's very much horses for courses. And with altitude sickness, of course, different people can get it at different times. So the climbers don't get surprised at all when one of their number who's never had it before, experienced climber, can have it. And Tillman described it, you know, how he got it on some occasions and he didn't get it on others when he was climbing in the Himalayas. But yeah, I always use Diamox. I swear by it. I don't know what the side effects of Diamox are, but I don't think they're too bad. It's certainly much better than having altitude sickness.
so Julie or Charlie, do you have a question?
Yes. I want to ask you about the Caspian Sea and getting on that ferry. And you're saying that really, because that really blotted the trip at the beginning, didn't it? It left you very anxious. You didn't know if you'd be able to get over, what would happen and how long it would hold up. If you were doing it again, or if you're advising Globebusters, who would you bribe and how much would you budget?
Well, if I do it again, the big mistake was for Turkmenistan, there's 2 visas. There's the tourist visa, which is 6-week visa, but you must have a guide. Or there's the transit visa, which is 5 days. So the tourist visa is £200. In the course of things is nothing. And also, Turkmenistan is a very beautiful country, and we could have not gone on that dreadful route to Ashgabat, but we could have gone northeast to this amazing fireball, which is a sinkhole in the ground 1.5 miles across, where a gas field has collapsed. The roof has collapsed, and this field lights up, and you can see it for hundreds of miles at night, but it's really something to visit at night. And then you can go on to the Nikus Museum. Some of the roads are quite sandy, and we would have been all right doing it, and then go down southeast, down the Oxus back to Bukhara. That's what we should have done. And we should have spent a lot more time going into the mountains on the Iranian border in Turkmenistan. There's some beautiful villages and cities. So that was a mistake. I regret that. And when we got into Uzbekistan, of course, we had to wait 10 days for Susan and the other guys to turn up, which we could have spent, you know, traveling around Turkmenistan and enjoying it. So that's definitely the thing to do, not to skimp on Turkmenistan. or Uzbekistan.
Bribing, it wasn't bribing so much as having a guide when you got there.
I mean, what happened in Azerbaijan, in Baku, was that John was still had influence, having been in, you know, Rolls-Royce. He had contacts in Baku, and he had an Azerbaijani friend who actually had to help sort out the visas because they were messing us around. We were going to actually lose the trip if we didn't get going. As I said, we put that pressure on ourselves by having the transit visa. I had also forgotten to pick up a bit of paper at the Georgia-Azerbaijani border so that my exit from Baku into the Caspian Sea was illegal. But it became such a shambles that I just slipped onto the ferry. We weren't supposed to be on that ferry. That was illegal as well because it was a petroleum ferry. So after that was quite a tense moment. In fact, everyone got fed up with John for being a bit chief executive-y, and David lost his temper with him and told him to shut up. And he wasn't chief executive of us lot. And it all settled down after that. And so that was when we couldn't uplift the blog. I mean, the other interesting thing was that because John was sort of, you know, an international industrialist, he had been warned by MI6 that we shouldn't stay in Turkmenistan very long and we shouldn't write a blog because the Iranians would nab us one night in a hotel and whisk us across the border back to Iran as a hostage. But David and I thought this was a load of codswallop and that wouldn't happen. But anyway, so the blog had to be private, not to be open. It didn't matter really, but I think that John was a bit worried about that. Interestingly enough, when we got back, John was asked to give a talk like this to MI6, where they enjoyed it. No, he's a very good speaker, I suspect. But yes, I think, you know, there are a lot of people who had a lot of good fun in Turkmenistan, and I think we could have planned it better.
Okay, great. So last opportunities, because Simon's voice is struggling, and so I don't want to put too much pressure on him. He's been very good to be able to stick it out all this far. But last chance to ask a question. Stefan, you're unmuted. Is that just because you're unmuted, or do you have a question you wanted to ask?
Well, I was just going to ask how much did you need to budget for bribes? Bribes weren't mentioned very much.
No, I could have talked more about that, but so Richard, Nick, and John were sort of signatories to the international, you know, bribery agreements with their international companies, so that if they were caught by the Americans having given bribes in any of these countries, they would face, you know, possible jail sentences. And so we didn't want to give bribes. We never gave any bribes, and that caused us some interesting problems. So we realized that if you just sort of go with the flow and you don't offer them any money, you remain, let's say, at Turkmenbashi, it was clear that they wanted something off us. They wanted money and they wanted antibiotics, but we wouldn't give them either to start with. We wouldn't give them any antibiotics or money. So we spent 6 hours all through the night being re-examined. They even got the doctor in to be re-examined just to check we hadn't got SARS. And then the doctor went off shift and they would need to get another doctor, and it was going on and on and on. And then what happened was that all the border guards were getting so hosed off because they weren't getting off duty. So that the longer we left it, we realized that in the end, we became more of a problem to them than they were to us. And that was really exemplified. When we got to Kashgar, they said, you've got to go back up to the Toragat Pass and all the way to Bishkek to get another copy of your visa, because you need 2 copies. And we were so beaten up by that trip. We said we couldn't go back. They said, well, you've got to go back. And they said, we can't go back. We're too physically exhausted. And I've got altitude sickness, or I had it. The others were absolutely whacked, but they wanted us to go straight back to do a return trip of 250 miles over the pass to get it. And, you know, the day wore on. They messed us around. And then we said to them, listen, you know, you've got a beautiful photocopier. Just photocopy the one visa, group visa we've got, and no one will ever know. It's a photocopy anyway. And they said, no, we don't do that sort of thing in China. Well, it wasn't until about 6:30 when they all needed to go home that the head guy said, oh, stuff it, just photocopy it. And at that point, we realized, although there were guards wandering around with guns and no one was being unpleasant, we realized that if we didn't bribe anybody, we just sat it out, eventually they'd get fed up. And that was our policy throughout. We got stopped by the police once for going over a white line in Uzbekistan. They tried to fine us $700. And at that point, I think Richard took over and said, okay, let's all go to the local police station and sort this out. Whereupon the guy immediately took the paper back off us and told us to go away. So
It was back
and
pocket money.
in Kyrgyzstan, they say, you know, if any policeman tries to stop you and take money off you, ask to go back to the police station, because we have a national policy that if any bribery is going on with the police, we go to the police station, it'll be stopped. So otherwise, it wasn't a problem.
Very good.
A long-winded answer, sorry.
But a very good answer. Thank you. So, Simon, I'm going to let you off the hook. I'm very grateful to you for sharing your experience and your time with us. I think that you've certainly opened my eyes to traveling, or in fact, not traveling in the Far East. I think I'll just fly places and whatever. But that sounds like a huge amount of fun. So thank you very much for giving us your time. We're very grateful to it. And we hope your cough gets a bit better as the weather changes. Thanks very much, everybody. Good evening. Our next talk will be, it'll be in May. And I think that will be 2 ex-colleagues of mine, Catherine Colson, who is a Bristol graduate, and Melanie Griffin, who's a Bristol graduate, one from the 70s, one from the 90s, talking about some of their experiences returning to my educational theme. So I look forward to that, and look forward to seeing many of you that as well. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night. Safe journey home. Mind the stairs as you go up. Victor Barley is clapping. I think that's very appropriate.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, all.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.